I'm joined by Dr. Barrett. He is an internationally recognized cardiologist with a special interest in the prevention and treatment of coronary heart disease. He has a very informative Substack Twitter feed, which is always illuminating, and his website, myhearthealth.ie. Dr. Barrett, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thanks so much.
Now, just a very broad question to start off with. As a society, I think we're much better informed than our parents and our grandparents, primarily because of accumulated knowledge on the internet, etc., when it comes to our health. My question, I suppose, is this education, an increase in education, reflected in the numbers presenting with heart problems?
So I think the answer that I would pose to that is really based around the quotation that says the future is here, it's just unevenly distributed. And so when we actually look at the statistics, if I can say that correctly, around cardiovascular disease, we know leading cause of death worldwide by a factor of 2, and in developed nations, it's on par with all the cancer deaths combined. And so they're the statistics that we commonly use to, I suppose, convey the impact of the burden of cardiovascular disease. But I think it's also important to actually take a step back and look at the death rates from cardiovascular disease over the last century in particular. Since the 1960s, in most developed nations, the death rates from cardiovascular disease have probably halved. So we've actually made spectacular progress. Now, they were rising up until the 1960s, but the competing cause of death prior to that was largely infectious diseases. So if you go back 100 years, infectious diseases were really kind of the driving cause of death. It wouldn't have been unusual for someone in their 50s to be dying from tuberculosis, for example. But once, smoking took hold kind of as a major pastime for everyone in the world, people were dying from heart disease at nearly twice the rate that they were dying today. But the reality is everyone has to die from something at the end. So there's always going to be a leading cause of death. That leading cause of death is unlikely to turn out to be boredom, but there's always going to be a leading cause of death. But it's important to recognize the progress that we have made. The challenge is that benefit has been unevenly distributed in terms of the educational awareness and the environmental context that people spend their time in. If you look in the United Kingdom, where there's relatively good nearby data, if you live in Glasgow as opposed to London, you're about 3 times more likely to die from cardiovascular disease at age less than 75. So, as I said, the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed.
Well, I suppose then that kind of changes then the scope of my next question in relation to, we always hear about the impacts of diet, poor diet, and lack of exercise on heart health. So I suppose if I had to pin you down, which one would be more crucial? But I suppose that depends really where in the world you are and what your education levels are.
So the answer is it's both, but we can get into the specifics in terms of where, if I had to kind of make a bet. The common kind of refrain is you can't outrun a bad diet and you can't out-diet not exercising. You have to do both, but you have to look at the factors that are actually driving you to engage in regular physical activity and also engage in eating behaviors that are considered healthy. If you're in a significantly lower socioeconomic class, so you live in underserved housing with poor facilities around you in a food desert, maybe you have multiple jobs, poor sleeping surroundings, poor noise pollution and air pollution, the likelihood of you being able to engage in regular physical activity and actually eat a healthy diet is not impossible, but it's just much harder for you to do that unless, as compared to someone in a higher socioeconomic status, where the opportunity to do that is just easier. So again, it's a terminology around odds and statistics. And humans are incentive-based creatures. And I use this quotation all the time by Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's business partner. Show me the incentive and I will show you the outcome. And unfortunately, people in the lower socioeconomic brackets are just highly incentivized to actually engage in worse behaviors compared to those in higher socioeconomic classes. And this is what's driving a lot of the inequality of health across different domains. If you look at the comparison between kind of low and high socioeconomic groupings, those in the lower socioeconomic groupings have a lifespan that's on average 10 years shorter than their peers. So we know that drives a huge amount of the health-related behaviors. In terms of the specific activities, in terms of diet and exercise, for example, if you look at people who are in the highest levels of aerobic fitness, for example, as measured by VO2 max, and you compare them to the kind of the bottom 20%, the people who are kind of the very fit individuals are 5 times less likely to die over a 10-year period. Now, there's arguably nothing else in medicine or healthcare that drives that degree of delta in terms of mortality difference over that kind of time frame. And that's an all-cause mortality benefit. That's not dying from, say, cardiovascular disease or another specific disease. That's dying from anything. Now, we know that if you don't do any exercise, though, the stringency of your diet is going to have to be very, very significant. Whereas you do have more latitude with your diet if you're exercising at a high level and you're burning off that fuel. But the reality is you're still going to end up in a low strength category. You're still going to end up in a low muscle mass category. And those two parameters are, again, both predictors of increased risk of the major chronic diseases that are likely to lead to our death and all-cause mortality. So if I were going to pick one with a gun to my head, it would be exercise.
I'm glad you said that, because that leads me very nicely to the next question. And I noticed on your Twitter feed recently, you talked about the benefits of walking. And I smiled because I've spoken about walking and the benefits of such a simple exercise, a daily pastime on this podcast before. Can you just recount for the listeners why walking is so valuable? So
walking in general is not going to get you the kind of the aerobic benefits that we talk about in kind of for the most part in terms of higher intensity exercise, for example, and improvements in VO2 max. But walking in terms of an activity, and depending on the class that you talk about it at zone 0, zone 1, is going to add significant benefit in terms of mitochondrial optimization, increasing muscle mass and performance. But we know that, again, long-term all-cause mortality data, if you're getting more than 7,000 steps a day, which is actually hard to do when you start to track your steps, and particularly as a sedentary environment and you're working in an environment where you're sitting, but getting more than 7,000 steps a day reduces your chances of dying from anything by about 50 to 70% compared to those who are, say, getting, less than 3,000 steps a day. So the mortality benefits are enormous. The functional conditioning kind of benefits, the benefits extend, hugely in terms of the benefits of walking. And there really isn't, too much walking that you can do. So again, as a stepping stone, I think everyone should be doing loads and loads of walking. But again, it's a stepping stone, I would see, in addition to building onto that, if you can, with kind of more higher level aerobic activity and also strength and conditioning training.
Is there any negative effect or for those individuals who engaged in very high intense activity over a longer period of time, or endurance exercises? Is there any downside to doing that much for the heart?
So the answer is probably yes. But the reality is the people who are doing very, very high levels of activity to that degree that are likely to cause downside are a very small minority of people. We know, and this is literature, I suppose, derived from those in terms of doing very long endurance cross-country skiing in the Nordic countries, that they're at higher rates of atrial fibrillation, a heart rhythm disorder that increases the risk of stroke. They're at higher rates of having higher deposits of calcification in the coronary arteries, although they have less heart attacks as a consequence of those. So they maybe have more heart disease, but less events. But the percentage of people in a general population who will fall into that category is exceptionally small. So what I would say is it is a real issue. It probably is a concern for very, very long distance endurance athletes, but for the majority of people, it's not going to be an issue.
You mentioned calcification there. Is that the same as the plaques that develop as a result of atherosclerosis?
Yes. So one of the common tests that is used to detect the presence of plaque in your coronary arteries is by doing what's called a CT calcium score, or a CT coronary angiogram. And when we look at plaque in the arteries, as it goes through its different phases of progression from an early fatty streak, it progresses up to the point of becoming calcified. That calcification is actually a repair mechanism to stabilize the plaque and make it less likely to rupture and cause a heart attack. So the amount of calcification you have is a proxy measure for the amount of plaque that you have in your coronary arteries. And we know in general, the more plaque that you have, the higher the risk of having a heart attack. But we know that broadly that if you look at, say, a 50-year-old male, there's about a 50% chance or just below that they will have some plaque. But the question is degree. And if they have a lot of plaque, that's a very significant risk marker for their risk of a heart attack over the next 10 years. But you always have to calibrate that figure with the age of the individual who's being scanned. So if you take a 30-year-old individual and they have any calcification at all, that's a very bad sign and an indication that they have developed advanced plaque in the coronary arteries, even though it's a small amount, at a very early age, and the trajectory that they are on is very concerning.
Is it possible to reduce the level of plaque in your arteries, or is it a case of what you have, you hold?
So for the most part, you're going to have a stable amount of plaque if you have plaque. It does grow in kind of fits and starts. It doesn't grow in a very linear progression. But we know from various different studies looking at ultrasound in the actual artery walls, in individuals who can optimize all the risk factors to a very significant degree. And that means taking, say, LDL levels down to the range of, say, 1.4 or below, we can actually reduce plaque burden. You can actually change the volume of plaque by generally single-digit percentages. And the evidence around that, although it's not a randomized data set, would suggest that lower plaque volumes leads to lower event rates. So yes, you can. You can also change the composition of the plaque. So plaque is made up of largely, we would say, calcified and non-calcified plaque. And you can change the composition of that plaque from non-calcified plaque, which is often considered more risky plaque for rupture, to calcified plaque. So you can induce plaque regression with the right set of ingredients, and you can stabilize that plaque and make it less likely to rupture. Can you get rid of plaque in kind of the sense that you can clear it out of your arteries? Probably not at the moment. There's small case series that describe people of reducing scores. I would be hopeful and optimistic that we can do that in the future, but reliably to kind of reduce scores or significant plaque burdens by a large degree, I think we're not fully there yet for everyone.
I know you've done some work with Headspace before. Everybody knows about, and we hear it constantly about the effects of stress on our psyches. Can you tell me how stress, chronic stress over a long period of time affects our heart health?
So I think you need to separate kind of stress into its intrinsic components in terms of how it's going to affect you in terms of the physiology, cortisol levels, heart rate variabilities, et cetera. And also the secondary consequences in terms of the health-related behaviors that you're less likely to engage in. And I would argue that probably the latter is more important. Because if you look at the four pillars that we're trying to get right in terms of stress, so in terms of optimizing our health, there's really only four things we can modify. That's our nutrition, exercise, sleep, and stress. But if you get stress wrong, or kind of you're under significant stress for whatever reason, your sleep is likely to deteriorate. If your sleep deteriorates, the stress gets worse. If both of those deteriorate, it's likely that your exercise and nutrition falls off. And so if you get stress right, you get sleep right. And if you get sleep right, you're likely to get exercise and nutrition right. So getting stress, the stress component here is a big issue in terms of the secondary consequences. Yes, there are kind of the intrinsic cortisol kind of mediated effects and all the other kind of adrenergic components. But in terms of the secondary consequences, I would expect that they're likely to have a greater consequence.
Okay, so the emphasis then is on, just to clarify for listeners then, once you're stressed, that's going to affect your sleep. Your sleep will then affect your diet and your ability then to exercise, which will then have a knock-on effect for your heart health.
Correct, yes. So because we know that in terms of, if you look at individuals, say, who don't do those kind of classic activities, so they have low levels of physical activity, poor diet, kind of higher stress environments, poor sleep, consistently across all the literature, we see higher rates of heart disease. And all of this is basically trying to tilt odds in our favor. The reality is if you live long enough, you're almost certainly going to develop a significant amount of plaque in your coronary arteries and have a consequence from that, such as, say, a heart attack or stroke. But for some individuals, they're building up plaque so slowly that time point might be having them reach, say, 200 years of age, and something else will be a competing cause of death. And that's always what the objective is to try and tilt the odds as much as possible in your favor to develop significant plaque in your coronary arteries as late as is possible. Because if we look at, again, just raw statistics in terms of what people die from, in the developed world, if you're a non-smoker, the thing that you're likely to die from is cardiovascular disease, cancer, or dementia. And if you look at the healthy centenarian population, the people who live to, say, 100 years of age, who are kind of relatively healthy, they, for the most part, die from the same things as everybody else: cardiovascular disease, cancer, and dementia. Throw in a couple of falls there as well. The key difference between those two groups is the centenarians get those conditions approximately 20 to 25 years later than everybody else. So the key in terms of living longer, for the most part, is to delay the onset of the major chronic diseases that are likely to kill you. Can we ever prevent them in their entirety given a long enough time horizon? I think that's unlikely based on our current technologies and understanding.
When it comes to prevention, if we are exercising, as you've advised, if we are eating healthily, and if we are controlling our stress levels and we're getting good quality sleep, do we need to have regular checkups then for our heart health?
I would argue that is yes, because there are other components that actually drive your risk that may not be in the control of those parameters. There are people with genetic dyslipidemias. There are other kind of congenital conditions that you can be born with. There are other unmeasured variables, for example, that actually can increase your risk of heart disease. So there are some individuals who have a genetic cholesterol disorder that isn't detected on standard cholesterol tests. They do most of the kind of healthy behaviors. And then when you actually do a CT scan on them, you find that they have a significant amount of plaque in the coronary arteries, which is unexpected. And whether or not you can actually determine what is actually driving that risk, it is helpful if you can, but you can still reduce their risk. And so that is important to do. Often you can work that out on the basis of that they will have an early family history of heart disease, but that's not always the case.
So at what age then, let's say they don't have a family history, at what age then should somebody consider then going and have their cardiovascular health checked out by their doctor?
Well, again, it depends what you mean by having your cardiovascular health checked out. I would argue that every individual, even from childhood years, should certainly know what their cholesterol levels are. We know that genetic cholesterol disorders are incredibly common, so having very, very high cholesterol even from childhood is important. We know that, in your kind of early adult years, it's important to make sure that your cholesterol levels, your blood pressures, your weight, your degrees of physical activity, et cetera, are all optimized, because this is all kind of an exposure over time. And this is why having cardiovascular risk factors early in life is a big problem, because you have the exposure for longer. So if you're a 65-year-old male and you develop high cholesterol and high blood pressure at age 65, you've spent a significant proportion of your life without those factors. But if you're an 18-year-old female who's developed these risk factors, you have a big exposure time. So I would argue having those parameters, I suppose, evaluated or considered as early in life as possible is very important. The degree of testing that you would do in terms of imaging, for example, doing a CT scan, is something that should be arguably left to later in life, or certainly at least 10 years before the onset of a significant event in, say, a parent. So if you had a parent who had a heart attack at 52, it might be worthwhile kind of in your early 40s to have a more advanced test at that time.
We haven't mentioned smoking so far. How much worse does that make the situation?
So the analogy that I give for, I suppose, how plaque in the artery develops is that I'm throwing a tennis ball at a window pane. Cholesterol is the tennis ball. And the higher your cholesterol, you're basically throwing more tennis balls. If you have high blood pressure, you're just throwing those tennis balls harder. If you're a smoker, you're walking up to the glass and smashing it with a hammer. And that is, I suppose, directionally correct. And I often actually don't talk about smoking cessation because the impact is so big. But the frightening thing is that about 1 in kind of 5 people in the developed world still smoke. So although we have made tremendous progress, and those statistics that I mentioned at the start in terms of halving of the death rates, et cetera, are largely probably driven by, in large part, the reductions in smoking, it's still a big issue for people.
A lot of people use vaping as a substitute for trying to get off cigarettes. Has there been any research to show any good or bad effects on heart health if people are vaping instead of smoking?
So if you look at the literature on vaping, and it's not an area that I have a huge depth of knowledge, but you can see certain adverse outcomes in terms of for cardiovascular health related to vaping. But you need to put it in context of the effect size between the impact of vaping and smoking cigarettes. So is vaping good for you? No. Is vaping infinitely better for you than smoking? Probably yes. So, it needs to be put in context. Would I prefer that you did neither? Of course. Would I prefer that if someone to say, I'm going to put a vape in your mouth or a cigarette, it would be a vape.
Can I ask you before I let you go, Dr. Barrett, there are so many areas of medicine. What was it in particular about the heart and about cardiology that interested you?
I'd love to give a really sensible answer, but I think most of this is confabulation, and I think we wander into these different specialties. I actually started my training thinking that I was going to be a cardiac surgeon. I then transitioned to being a cardiologist, putting kind of stents in people's arteries, and then I realized when I was doing that really, even kind of at that time point, you're finding people decades too late. And so my whole objective was to actually work with individuals, ideally decades prior to them ever needing anything like that, and ultimately never requiring it in the first place. And I think when I reflect on kind of maybe why I did it, you've got the biggest burden of disease that is largely preventable. So kind of on a simple math basis, in terms of the ability to make a difference, it's very appealing.
Well, I think your ability to communicate and the substance of your message is certainly that something I think that can and will make a difference. I'd like to thank you for joining me on the Happy Habit podcast today. Thank you so much, Dr. Paddy Barrett.
Thanks so much.